bright and early here, and we are on the last story of the book of Genesis, the Joseph cycle. Um, the we are going to do one more session after this, where I'll tell you something, a parable of Jesus that you all know and love, but once you hear it and read it after having plodded through all of Genesis, you'll say, "Oh, that's what it was about," and you'll just never read it the same way again. So that'll be exciting. But today we're going to finish up Genesis with the Joseph cycle. Joseph is a little different from all of the other stories that we've been looking at. It's different. Well, for one thing, it's a different author. Remember I told you way back at the beginning that that the Torah had undergone several major revisions, and there were two different creation narratives written by different people. Well, so we think that the major storyline of Genesis, from that second creation narrative all the way through all the stuff that we've done so far, came to us largely from one writer, one edition. We call them the J source. Doesn't really matter. Of course, it went through some editing and some redaction and so forth, but mostly that source came from one author. The Genesis narrative is by somebody else. It has a different character. We call him the E source. So has different writing, different style, and it's also much longer than anything else we see in Genesis. It takes up 13 of the last 14 chapters of the book. There's one other story kind of stuck in the middle by an editor that doesn't seem to be connected. It's different in that it is a lot more detailed than a lot of the other stuff that we've had. So we've talked about this quite a bit. The richness of the stories comes from their minimalist character. The detail is intentionally so minimalist that you can sort of dive into it, speculate about things. Joseph is not like this. Joseph's story is far more detailed. That's why it's so much longer. Far more detailed. It gives you everything right there. So in some ways, I'm just gonna tell the story today with with minimal commentary. So let's dive right in. It's Genesis 37 to 50, with the exception of chapter 38, which is that other story stuck in the middle. If you want to pause and read it, please be my guest. Otherwise, we're just going to jump in. So Joseph is the youngest of the sons of Jacob, the 12 sons of Jacob, who become the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, right off the bat, I'm going to have to throw in a little bit of commentary there, in that this is, because it's so long and so detailed, Joseph's story is one of the ones where we can see kind of the layers of editing that happen in Genesis. So I say he's the youngest of the 12 sons of Jacob. Well, everybody knows that Jacob has 12 sons. Anybody who would have been working on editing, redacting, collecting the story knows that Jacob has 12 sons, because they are the 12 tribes of Israel. They might not necessarily have known who the 12 sons were and in what order they were born, and so on and so forth. So you get a little bit of funny business when you get different lines of the text from different editors. So at the beginning of the story, Joseph seems to be the youngest son at that time of 12 sons. Later, when Joseph is away in Egypt, we'll talk about that in a minute, he seems to be the second youngest of 12 sons, because another son needs to be born as part of the story, but then some other son has to just sort of get dropped out of the mix in order to make that math work, because you got to have the 12. And then again, at the end of the story, two of Joseph's own sons are adopted by his father Jacob, which again makes 12. So another son somehow gets dropped from that story. This is the way these things work. So anyhow, Joseph at this time is the youngest of 12 sons, and his father Jacob loves him the most. this is a very familiar kind of story by now, right? The youngest son is the chosen one. So you know that Joseph gets from his father Jacob a beautiful coat of many colors. Interesting thing about the history of the Hebrew Bible is that it was written, of course, in Hebrew, but it was translated into Greek sometime after Alexander the Great Hellenized the entire region, and which is to say, sometime before the time of Jesus. So most New Testament authors, when they're quoting from the Hebrew Bible, will quote the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, because most of them spoke Greek. So interestingly, we actually have older copies of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, than we do of the original Hebrew. So it's not always clear which is the better, more accurate text to work with. Obviously, the Greek is a translation, but we have it much closer to the source than we have copies of the Hebrew. So there is a variant in the idea that Joseph has a coat of many colors comes from that Greek translation. Our modern English translators use both and try to figure out what's the best word to use. And then whichever one they go with, they'll often, if there's a variant, put a footnote. So you can find this information in the footnotes of your Bible, most likely. But the idea that Joseph has a coat of many colors comes from that Greek translation, the Septuagint. In Hebrew, the word we're unsure what it means, but it seems like it might mean a coat with long sleeves. So there you go. Joseph had a beautiful coat, either of many colors or possibly of long sleeves. But he had a special gift given to him by his father, sort of marking him as the chosen son. And he was also just a snotty-nosed brat, this kid. So he comes out to work in the fields with his brothers, and he says, "Hey guys, listen, I had this dream that we were out working in the fields, and you all had sheaths of grain, and they all bowed down to my giant sheath of grain. You're all going to bow down to me." And then in another time he tells them, "I had this dream where the sun and the moon and 11 stars," right? So his mom and dad and my 11 brothers all bowed down to me. Just a real jerk. So his brothers didn't like him. They might have overreacted a little bit because one day when Joseph comes out to the field, late of course, they say, "Let's kill him." Maybe an overreaction to the bratty little brother, but nevertheless. So they're planning to kill him, and the oldest brother, or at least he's the oldest brother during part of the story, Reuben, says, "Hey, wait a minute. Maybe let's not kill him. Let's just throw him in a pit and leave him." "That's not a great idea, Reuben. He'll eventually climb out of the pit and tell on you." So some other addition, which also gets put in the story just as a separate episode in the story, is that Jacob, who might also be the oldest brother, I'm sorry, not Jacob, Jacob's the dad, the Judah, who might also be the oldest brother, says, "Let's not kill him, let's sell him into slavery." So that turns out to be a better idea because then, he won't tell dad. So a band of Ishmaelites, you remember Ishmael, a band of Ishmaelites, people from Ishmael, come along, and they happen to be in the market for slaves. And so they sell their brother into slavery to these Ishmaelites, and they take his coat, the coat that his father gave him, the coat of many colors or of long sleeves, and they dip it in goat's blood, and they bring it back to dad and say, "Look what we found. Joseph wandered off, and he must have been attacked by a wild animal and killed." So, of course, Jacob mourns and weeps for his son. So Joseph is taken by the band of Ishmaelites, and he's sold into slavery to a guy named Potiphar. And Potiphar is the captain of Pharaoh's guard, a very important military general in Israel. And if you're thinking to yourself, man, Joseph is down in the depths here, right? He was sold into slavery by his own brothers. He's in this foreign land that he does not know. If you're thinking, wow, he's in a bad way, you're absolutely right. That's the right thing to be thinking, but don't invest too much in that thought because it'll change. So Joseph is a slave in Potiphar's house, and he becomes very efficient at what he does. God gives him favor. That's the refrain that keeps being used throughout this cycle of stories. God gives Joseph favor, means makes him honorable in everyone's sight. So he does really good work as a slave in Potiphar's house, and he ends up becoming, like, sort of working his way up through the ranks of Potiphar's servant and becoming sort of the manager of his whole household. He's a very important person on the staff almost of this. I mean, he's still a slave, but he's on the staff of this important military general. And he's a young, handsome fella. So Potiphar's wife, who's not named in the story, starts to come on to him. She tries to get him to go to bed with her several times. The story tells us, it's big, sort of overblown. Also draws a little bit on this sort of ancient woman as harlot, as seductress kind of notion. So she's drawing him in. She's trying to get him to go to bed, and he refuses. He's going to be an upright man. He wouldn't do that to his boss. And so one day, no one is in the house for some reason, and Joseph goes into the house to do his work, and Potiphar's wife starts to come on to him, and he is in what he thinks is a dangerous situation, so he runs away. But she grabs onto his cloak as he's running and holds it. So he leaves that behind and he runs away to get out of the situation. And then Potiphar's wife gets upset and she claims that Joseph tried to rape her. And she holds up the cloak as proof that this happened. By the way, this is an interesting thing. There's the other story that we're skipping over that got added into the Joseph stories in Genesis chapter 38. It's a nasty story, a really disturbing story about Judah, one of the older brothers, raping his daughter-in-law, and it's really terrible. But the way that it's really about kind of a badass woman getting what she's owed, and she does so by stealing Judah's cloak. And so there's all this stuff about, Joseph has this coat of many colors or of long sleeves. There's Tamar stealing Judah's coat. There's Potiphar's wife holding on to Joseph's coat. So there's this really interesting theme that I haven't quite worked out what it's about, but be interesting to trace through. Okay, so Joseph is accused of raping Potiphar's wife, and he's thrown into prison in Potiphar's house. So we're in the basement of Potiphar's house. There's a prison for prisoners of Pharaoh, the king. And so Joseph is there. And he's there with, or shortly after he's put in prison, two other prisoners of the king get put into prison with Joseph. They are the baker for the king and the cupbearer to the king. Now, the cupbearer is something like, it's really unclear. It's a very high and trusted official in the king. Seems to be possibly that they would have drunk any wine that the pharaoh was going to drink, taken a sip to see to it that it wasn't poisoned or hadn't gone bad. It wouldn't make him sick in some way. So very trusted official. And for some reason, these two people both were thrown into prison, and they're there with Joseph, and both of them have a dream. And they wake up in the morning and they're disturbed and they don't know what's happening. And Joseph says, well, let me hear it. I'm good with dreams. And so the cupbearer says, well, I had a dream that a long vine grew with 3 grapes on it. And I took the grapes and I squeezed them into the king's cup and into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave it to Pharaoh. And Joseph said, well, that's an easy one. That the 3 grapes mean 3 days, and it means that after 3 days you'll be restored to your position as the cupbearer to Pharaoh. The cupbearer says, all right, that's a good dream. And Joseph says, just one thing: when you get out in those 3 days, will you remember me? Will you put in a good word for me? I'm innocent. Please tell them, see if you can do something for me. And the cupbearer says, of course, yes, of course, I'll do that. So then the baker says, well, that's a good interpretation. I want to hear, something like that too. And so he says, I had a dream where I was carrying 3 baskets of bread for the king, for Pharaoh, on my head. And the ravens swooped down and ate the bread out of the baskets. And Joseph says, oh, sorry to tell you this, but that dream means that the 3 baskets are 3 days, and in 3 days, Pharaoh will have your head chopped off. Well, lo and behold, 3 days from that day is Pharaoh's birthday, and Pharaoh has a grand, of course, birthday celebration. And some of the things that he does for entertainment at this celebration are, 1, to release a prisoner, his cupbearer, and restore him to his previous position, just as Joseph had interpreted, and to hang the baker right there at the party. So Joseph was right on both accounts. The only thing is, the cupbearer does not remember Joseph. This is a bit of foreshadowing, actually. The next book in the Bible, the book of Exodus, begins with a Pharaoh who does not remember Joseph. And so the people of Israel end up in slavery, for some long time. Anyhow, so Joseph is forgotten, and he spends 2 years rotting in Potiphar's prison. Until one day, 2 years later, the Pharaoh himself has a dream. Pharaoh's dream is that out of the Nile River come 7 big, fat, juicy, beautiful cows. And they're grazing on the grain and the grass. And then 7 skinny, sickly, ugly cows come up out of the Nile as well, and they gobble up the 7 big, beautiful, fat cows. So Pharaoh is very disturbed about this dream, and he begins to ask, his wise men and his magicians. Again, this is a theme that we'll see repeated in Exodus. We think this Joseph story was written by the same person who wrote a lot of the Exodus story, and so you get a lot of this repeating, where the Pharaoh's magicians and wise men are really fools compared to God's servant, God's prophet, right? So no one can figure out what Pharaoh's dream means. And just then the cupbearer says, oh, yeah, you know what? One time, a couple of years ago, you put me in prison. Big misunderstanding. I'm not worried about it anymore. But there was a guy who interpreted my dream, and he interpreted it just right. Also, the baker who you killed, I think his name was Joseph. Why don't you grab him? So Pharaoh calls for Joseph to come in and interpret the dream, and Joseph does so quite easily. He says, oh yes, the 7 big fat cows are 7 years of plenty, 7 years of abundance in Egypt. But the 7 skinny cows are 7 years of famine, which are coming right after, on the heels of the 7 years of abundance. So what you need to do, Pharaoh, is you need to put someone in charge of taking care of all the grain, making sure we store up plenty of food and grain during those 7 really good, abundant years, so that we'll have things left over to survive through the 7 bad years. And so Pharaoh says, I think that's a great idea, Joseph. And not only do I believe your interpretation of the dream, I'm going to make you in charge of this project. So Joseph becomes a very important person, not now a slave of Potiphar, but on the cabinet of Pharaoh. So you notice these major swings, right? Bratty kid thinks he's in charge of the world, gets sold into slavery, then he becomes an important slave in this important general's house, back into prison, back up to now he's an important person on the cabinet of Pharaoh. He's in charge of taking care of the food supply. Okay, so that's kind of the first part of Joseph's story, and then we get a camera pan away to meanwhile back in Canaan. What's happening with dad and brothers? Well, the famine has spread to all the land, and they're hungry. They're hungry. So this is after the 7 years of abundance, into the famine. Joseph is an important person, and Jacob and his other sons get hungry. Of course, believing Joseph is long dead, and so Jacob says, "Why don't you go down to Egypt and buy some grain?" So the sons, all of the sons, except for one, who is now the youngest son, Benjamin. So if you sort of take the narrative flow of the story, you can imagine that that Joseph was the youngest son at the time, and that sometime since Benjamin has been born. Well, so the other sons all come to buy some grain, and who do they run into but Joseph? Of course, they don't recognize Joseph. He's fully been Egyptianized, right? He's working for Pharaoh. He's got the whole getup, very powerful. They don't expect him to even be alive. But Joseph definitely recognizes his brothers who beat him and sold him into slavery. So Joseph, being a wise man, decides that he's going to test the brothers. So he asks them lots of questions about who are you, and where do you come from? Do you have any other brothers? Is your father still alive? Is my father still alive? He wants to know. But of course, he's got to hold this all in. It's just an act. So he says, "Okay, I think that you're spies who have come to spy on us." And they say, No, we're not spies. We promise we're not spies. And they tell him all about themselves. And he says, "If you're not spies, if this story you tell me is true, then prove it by going back and getting your youngest son, your youngest brother, Benjamin, and bringing him here." Joseph wants to meet his brother, his only brother who didn't betray him, didn't sell him into slavery, a brother who he could love. Bring him back to me. And so that I know you'll do this, I'm going to hold on to one of you. So he takes one of the brothers, Simeon, and he locks him into prison. And he sends the rest away. He first fills up their bags with grain, of course. And so they buy the grain, and he tells the people who are filling up their sacks, fill their sacks with grain, but also the money that they gave us to pay for the grain, slide that in there as well. Give them their money back. So they all go back home, except for poor Simeon, who's in prison. And they journey back to Canaan, and as they get home, they start to pull out their grain and realize, oh no, our money's in our bag. We didn't pay for this. We forgot to pay, or they gave it back to us on accident or something. They're going to think that we stole it. So they're very distraught. And so Jacob, the father, says, it's fine. You go back, you're going to take, he doesn't want them to take Benjamin. He's I've already lost my son Joseph. I now think I've lost my son Simeon. You can't take Benjamin. He'll be killed. So Jacob is very distraught, but they talk him into it. Dad, we have to do this. And so they take Benjamin. They take the money to buy a new supply of grain, as well as the money that they were returned for the old supply of grain. They don't want it to look like they stole it. And a gift, a large gift of nuts and honey and dates and all these things. Okay, so down they go into Egypt, and a second time with Benjamin. And so they get there and they say, look, we told you we were telling the truth. This is our youngest brother. And here we bought money to buy new grain, and we brought back the money from the last time we bought grain. Somehow we got home and it ended up in our bags. We don't know how. We brought you a gift. We don't want any trouble here. So they give all these things to Joseph, who they still don't know is their brother. And Joseph sees his brother Benjamin, and he's just overcome with joy and relief, and all of this years and years and years of not knowing his family, not being connected, and just weeps and weeps. He does this away in his room. He runs away to his room to do this so they won't see. He's still testing them. And so he throws them a big party and lots of food. And then he sends them away again with grain. This time he tells the person packing their grain, stick the money that they gave back in their bags along with the grain, and take my cup, my personal wine cup, my silver goblet, and stick it in the bag of the youngest son, Benjamin. Okay, so the people sneak these things into their bag, and off they go. And then Joseph sends out a guard, some soldiers, to overcome them and say, hey, somebody stole the cup of Joseph. Let me check your bags. So he starts checking through their bags and saying, oh, you have stolen money from us, and you've stolen money from us, and you stole the silver cup. You're all coming back with me. So the soldiers bring them back to Joseph. This is one last test, and Joseph scolds them for stealing all the things and says, but I'm a gracious man. I'm only going to take your youngest brother who stole the cup from me, and I'm going to have him killed. And then this thing Joseph has been waiting for. The possibly oldest brother, it depends on when the story is being told, Judah says, no, don't take him. Take me instead. And so now Joseph knows. He knows that his brothers have changed. That they're no longer these bullies who are going to beat up on the littlest one. They're actually going to take care of Benjamin. And so he tells them who he is. And he hugs them. And they embrace and they kiss. And he says, I forgive you, and I have missed you so much. Well, long story short, maybe it's already a little long. Joseph has a great family reunion. He moves his family, father and all of his brothers and sisters and mother. They all move down to Egypt with Joseph. He has such a powerful position there and lots of resources, and they set up camp there in Egypt. Wonderful for them. It will turn out badly for them in a few generations. And so here's this great ending to the cycle of the Genesis stories. If you remember way back at Cain and Abel, you have the younger son whose offering is chosen by God for reasons we can't understand, while the older son's offering is rejected. And so the older son gets angry and he kills the younger son. This is the human condition, right? After the fall of the sin of Adam and Eve, it's to be filled with rage and anger, to destroy one another. And then you have Isaac and Ishmael. The younger son, Isaac, is chosen. Ishmael is banished off into the desert. You have Jacob and Esau. The younger son, Jacob, steals the birthright and the blessing from his older son, Esau. Esau vows to kill him, wants to kill him, tries to kill him, but doesn't get a chance to before the younger son begins to bless his older brother. So you see this cycle, how sort of throughout this family history, they are learning. And now Joseph gets this chance to forgive his brothers, to bless them with grain and a good and abundant and happy life in Egypt, even though they tried to kill him. There's a great line that Joseph says, "What you intended for evil, this selling me into slavery, you intended for evil, God intended for good." And this is the story, right? That life-giving divine energy that flowed out of Eden. Remember, we said it would flow through Abraham's family. That Abraham's family was chosen to be a blessing for the nations, that all the nations of the world would be blessed through them. Well, this book is the story of that family learning how to become a blessing for others, how the chosen, how the unexpectedly chosen can be a blessing for the world rather than a curse for the world, like in the very beginning. And it's been a long story of trying to figure that out. In fact, Genesis has one of the best endings in the world. It's kind of like, you get to a movie and it's a big battle, and the bad guy gets finally defeated, and everything is calm and the city is happy again. And then just at the end, you see a flash of the face of the next bad guy, the setup to the sequel. So you get this cycle in Genesis of these jealous brother stories over and over and over again. And finally, they're figuring out how to be a blessing for each other. Well, we get to the very end, and Jacob is about to die, and he's blessing his sons, and he's going to give Joseph a double portion of the blessing. So he adopts Joseph's two sons. So you don't have a tribe of Joseph. Instead, you have these two sons who Jacob adopts, and he gives a blessing to them. And so Jacob is getting ready to do this, and he reaches out his right hand, the hand of the blessing, to give to Joseph's older son. Joseph positions his older son at Jacob's right hand to receive the blessing of the older son. He positions his younger son at Jacob's left hand and to receive that lesser blessing. And what does Jacob do? He crosses his hands and switches up the blessing again. So it's like, the cycle starts all over again. And that's the long story of Genesis. You've made it. Congratulations. We are going to end next week, as I said at the beginning, with a parable of Jesus that is really a commentary on all of these stories in Genesis. So hope to see you then. Take care.